So we need to look at this. This is better.
Recording in progress.
So you need to basically, yeah. So participants are joining. Okay. Good morning, colleagues, dear participants, ladies and gentlemen. We'll be starting our webinar soon on the topic of transformational adaptation within the adaptation continuum. So I'd like to give maybe 1 or 2 more minutes to the participants who are still joining before we begin. For the purpose of preparing the webinar, the information brief, we'll be recording this session only for the purpose of the note-taking, and hope it is okay with all the panel member and the speakers as well as with the audience. So with that, let me introduce myself. My name is Muzaharul Alam. I work as a regional coordinator for Climate Action Program for Asia and the Pacific region. And I will be moderating this webinar on transformational adaptation within the adaptation continuum. The primary objectives of our webinar today is to clarify the evolving concept of the transformational adaptation, including its conceptual foundation, the differentiation from the ongoing adaptation approaches, which often we refer the incremental adaptation. We will also examine how the diverse stakeholder groups across sectors, region, and the governance level understand the concept, interpret this idea, and apply the transformational adaptation in practices. We'll be also highlight the real-world example of the transformational adaptation across the geographic and the sectoral context. We have an excellent set of speakers and the panel member today join us, and I will be introducing them one by one with their details, but let me at least indicate who are with us today, and the audience will be hearing from them. So we'll start with an overarching the presentation on the transformational adaptation within the adaptation continuum by Joanna, and she is the associate professor in the Griffith University. Then we'll have the 2 panels. The first panel will be providing the reflection on the system perspective on the transformational adaptation. And we have the Bo from FAO, who will be providing the perspective on the food and agriculture system. Then we'll have Karma Raptan from UNDP will be reflecting on health, the livelihood, and the societies. Then we have the Rakibul Amin from IUCN will be providing the reflection on land, water ecosystem, and biodiversity. Then we have Arghya Singh from Asian Development Bank will be focusing her reflection on infrastructure, city, and the industries. After that, we have the second panel where we'll be getting the perspective on the geographical diversities as well as the perspective from academic and research institute. In that context, what we have from SPREP, Timochi Nakalevo, then we have the David Porter from ICIMOD, and then we have Osamu Mizono from IGS. After that, we will have the Q&A and an opinion poll, and my colleague will be supporting me running the session. And then we'll be having the wrap up where we'll try to capture the key points came out from our today's discussion. So with that, I would like to also mention before I give the floor to Joanna that in the webinar, you will see there is a Q&A channel. So for the audience who join us today, my request would be all of you to please present your question using the Q&A channel of the link. And I will also request the panel members and the speakers to keep eye on the question in case you'd like to respond directly, but we'll also find time to basically mention some of those questions and we'll ask the speakers to respond to. For the audience, it would be really helpful when you are posing your question, if you kindly mention who this question is directed to, that will be also very helpful. With that, it's my great pleasure to invite Joanna. As I mentioned, she is working for the Griffith University, but let me just mention a couple of her area of the work as an adaptation scientist with a PhD in the climate change adaptation in the Griffith University, based on the Gold Coast in Australia. Her research is focused on understanding how and why and when the people make decisions to adapt to climate change and what role science can and should play in that process. She is also a lead author for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change for the 6th assessment report, particularly for the working group, the chapter 15, working group 2 of the chapters 15, which focuses on the small islands. But she is also involved in preparing the summary for the policymakers. She is also involved in the multiple initiatives and supporting the area of the adaptation work, particularly focusing on understanding the core principle of the climate change adaptation and how adaptation science can play a positive role in evidence-based decision-making. With that, may I request Joanna to provide your perspective on the transformation adaptation within the continuum of the adaptation continuum. Sorry. So over to you, Joanna.
All right, thanks so much, Bapu. I'll just share my screen where I have my presentation. Okay, yeah, hang on. Make sure that you can see the slideshow. So thank you so much for this opportunity to come and talk about transformational adaptation within the adaptation continuum. As Bapu mentioned, I'm an associate professor here at Griffith University, based on the Gold Coast in Australia. And I was very, very happy to receive this invitation, just because this is one of the key concepts and key topics that we highlighted strongly in the previous assessment for IPCC in the working group too. So I'll share some of those, some examples, and I suppose this talk is supposed to also challenge some of the assumptions that we have about how we pick adaptation options as well. So the IPCC AR6, so in the glossary, we had definitions for both incremental adaptation and transformational adaptation. And the reason why this talk was titled as a continuum, because we do see that there are different types of adaptation actions. So some of those are more more incremental. So the incremental adaptation is maintaining often systems that are in place at the moment. And there has been a lot of talk, as Bapu mentioned already, in terms of, what's effective. And a lot of the times we say, well, incremental actions are effective to a point, but we really need to think about how do we scale, for instance, the benefits and outcomes of adaptation. And then there is the transformational adaptation that in AR6 we define as changing adaptation that actually changes the fundamental aspects of socio-ecological systems, and that's in anticipation of climate impacts, or as a response to current impacts as well. So those are really some of the key terms in AR6 that we looked at as well. So this is an example of some of the presentations that we did from working group to after the assessment was out. So in the UNFCCC, obviously, transformational adaptation in the context of the global goal on adaptation has been a really important concept as well. So this example comes from the UK in terms of, well, what does transformational adaptation, for instance, look like in practice? So this is Saltmarsh Creation in Sturt in the UK. And they had a big problem with, for instance, with flooding and with sea level rise. And this area was agricultural land, and it has been for generations. But because there were these climate impacts already occurring, the community and government came together to discuss some of the options of what would be the future of this area. And so they actually completely changed the land use. So going from agriculture, they actually created this biodiversity space that still has grazing cattle for food production, but it's really focused on conservation instead. And they've seen an increase in many of the bird species. They've seen changes in livelihoods. So there's a very thriving ecotourism at the moment, and communities can enjoy that space as well. So we use often this as an example on the questions, well, what does transformational adaptation look like? What is this fundamental change, for instance, in land use that we talk about? But why the talk was framed as a continuum is that there's different adaptation actions have different outcomes. And a lot of those actions that might have a transformational outcome, for instance, banning smoking in many countries, it doesn't necessarily mean that the act itself has been transformative. So in the banning smoking, so that is the law, so a law that has been enacted, and that obviously really shows a shift in social norms, and has had transformational health outcomes for many of us. But the action itself wasn't large scale and transformative, or a change basically in law. But we could look at, for instance, actions on keeping Venice. So we know that the city of Venice is sinking, and the sea levels are rising as well. And the whole city has been built on wooden poles. So there's going to be some very transformational actions that we have to take to keep that city as it is. And so in terms of the action and the investments that will need to go in, those will be transformational, but the actual outcome, keeping the system as is, could be classified as incremental. So I think this is a really interesting conversation as well. What do we think transformational adaptation is, and how do we make sure that these different types of actions also complement each other in climate adaptation? And some of the things that we need to consider as well are around justice and the differential impacts and differential vulnerabilities that different groups have. So for instance, on action on universal healthcare, free public transport, increased access to finance. So if we think about it, well, are these outcomes from these actions transformational, for instance, for particular groups or for particular people? So we could say that, well, for a lot of richer groups and individuals, these are not really that transformative. They're more incremental because they already have the adaptive capacity and resources to buy excellent healthcare. They have their own transportation systems most of the time, and they obviously often have increased access to finance already. So the outcomes won't be as transformational for those groups. But if we think about poorer groups and poorer individuals, a lot of these would be absolutely transformational. So when we talk about the link between an action and the outcome, we also need to think about for whom. So this is just a similar graph, but thinking about, well, you know, we have, for instance, early warning systems for all, that is now a global initiative, and the outcomes, if that succeeds, are really transformational. But the actions that are put in place are often, you know, improving the systems that we already have in place. So the action itself could be classified in incremental. But then we think about things like coastal defenses. So we've seen there's been a lot of research looking into the equity aspects of these as well, of adaptation actions. So we could say that, you know, there might be massive investments in transformational adaptation, so more investment in coastal defenses. But for a lot of richer communities, that means that their kind of, you know, systems are protected. But then if we think about poorer communities that are not, that might be actually impacted by these actions that the richer communities are supporting or investing in. So those outcomes might be transformational for the poorer communities, but not necessarily for the right reasons. So they might be actually worse off from having coastal defenses installed if they are not for everybody and not protecting everyone in that community or area. So I think that one of the key challenges we have when we talk about transformational is transformational for whom? And especially in the global goal and adaptation, we consistently have the discussion, well, how do we make sure that the adaptation strategies that we put in place, and if we tag them as transformational or incremental, how do we make sure that the outcomes are actually beneficial for Indigenous peoples, for women, youth, children, and other marginalized groups? And obviously that also relates to this discussion on, well, what is effective adaptation and what is just adaptation, even if it's in the transformational context. So the adaptation continuum, I think it's going to be a very key issue also in the next assessment for IPCC. So trying to understand, well, what actions can be scaled that are effective. But there's also, obviously, we need to think about the trade-offs between different values, different perspectives, and how do we make sure that the marginalized are also benefiting from adaptation. There might be new inequities arising as climate impacts are unfolding and new adaptation options are being trialed and implemented. But there's also new possibilities. So we have seen a lot of climate tech, a lot of technological solutions that are trying to also, while they obviously have their risks, they're also really trying to, you know, create these new opportunities that then increase and scale benefits for all. And also thinking about the transformational adaptation or incremental adaptation does not always have to be very high cost. So what are some of the leverage points that we can use that would be low cost but have high leverage? So if we go back to the example, for instance, banning smoking, so what are some of those examples that we can use in the existing systems to create truly transformational outcomes for all? And so thinking about future, I think it's a very exciting time to be having this webinar and the forum in Bangkok as well. But I think one of the things that I'm very interested in is also, well, what do we think about the future is going to be like? So what are some of the key assumptions or heuristics that we use to make those decisions and determinations? And this is really important because that also relates to what actions and what options we think are going to be effective in a changing climate. So with this short keynote, I hope that I have raised some interesting ideas, and I look forward to following the webinar.
Thank you so much, Joanna, for sharing how the conversation is happening within the IPCC and the type of examples that IPCC also trying to bring and showing when we are talking about the transformational adaptation, what those action looks like, but most importantly, the context behind those changes is happening. So I think that is an important message for all of us to keep in mind, but also what you ended up saying that what is the future is going to look like, as well as when we are talking about the transformational adaptation, is the transformational adaptation for who? The same action, what I understand from your presentation, that same action maybe become the transformational for one group of people, but may remain the incremental for another group of people, depending on their absorption capacity of the risk or the vulnerabilities. With that, thank you so much for sharing the thought. Participants, please feel free to ask the question to Joanna on the setting the scene, the keynote presentation on this transformational adaptation within the adaptation continuum. So with that, I'm also keeping eye on the screen, and I haven't seen any question yet, but I'm sure the audience will ask the question. Probably they have started thinking that what kind of the questions and the clarity that they would like to have from you, Joanna. So with that, as I mentioned, we will move to the first panel, where I will request Bo from FAO to share the perspective on the food and the agriculture system. But before I request Bo to share his thoughts and the way the audience or the actors sees the transformational adaptation within the food and agriculture system, Bo is the Natural Resource Officer for climate change and the climate finance for Food and Agriculture Organization of the UN system in the regional office for the Asia and the Pacific. Bo has over the past 19 years work experiences as a natural resource management specialist, focusing on promoting equitable, climate resilient, and the low emission development. Bo has experience delivering the regional and the national policy and the field level, the technical assistance program on climate change adaptation and mitigation, as well as the renewable energy development in over 25 countries in Southeast Asia, as well as in the Pacific and Southern Africa as well. So with that short introduction, Bo, over to you to share how the agriculture, the practitioners, and the communities conceptualize the transformational adaptation and how they operationalize it. And it's like what Joanna mentioned, there are critical elements. If you can also share some of those, the critical elements in the context of the food and agriculture system when we're talking about adaptation continuum as well as the transformational adaptation. So over to you, Bo.
Thanks, Babu, and thanks very much for the opportunity to be here for this inaugural event for the 9th APAN. It's a real honor. So noting that my time is limited, what I will try to do this morning is briefly touch upon some of the things that Joanna presented with respect to transformative adaptation in agri-food systems, why it's important for the agri-food system in the region, and then I'll dedicate a little bit of time at the end to some of the definitional issues of transformative adaptation in the agri-food system, and leave you with one example, which I hope is thought-provoking and helps you better conceptualize what it means in this sector. So Joanna's already covered some of this, of course. Maybe what's new here is some of the examples. And of course, at FAO, we have been trying for some time to think about how concepts of adaptation going from incremental through transformational, which is a major change within a system, to transformative change, which is system-wide or even across different systems. You know, how the work that we're doing with our partners across the region, what are the examples that, you know, define these types of adaptation? And here you can see some of the examples that have regularly been noted when talking about, say, incremental adaptation, which could be agronomic adjustments on farm in response to changes season to season, in growing conditions, through to transformational adaptation, which can be the wholesale adoption of a new approach like agroecology, and now thinking about transformative change. And the important starting point is to think about why transformative adaptation is important for the agri-food system. And I think, the core reason and why this is a timely discussion is that we know that climate change is already impacting on agricultural and food systems across the region. We know from increasing mounting scientific evidence that there are significant impacts when compared to the counterfactual baseline scenario on agricultural systems, on their productivity. And this, of course, has implications for livelihoods in agricultural systems across the region, but also, of course, for food security. The knowledge that we have at the moment points, of course, to severe impacts, particularly from extreme weather. We also know that average conditions and changes in average conditions over time do have significant impacts on productivity in the agricultural systems. We also, in the past have had limited understanding beyond a few specific cropping systems, but that knowledge of how climate change is impacting on a range of systems such as agricultural labor, livestock, fisheries and forestry is expanding and improving. And this helps us also to say more about the broader impacts of climate change at the food system level. What we can say is that the cumulative impact, both past and what we anticipate in the future, is concerning, particularly from a food security perspective. Just to highlight briefly what I mean here, I'm going to try and quickly summarize a few interesting papers regarding the impacts and in terms of why it's important to think about transformative adaptation in agriculture. This is a presentation of the impact of changes in temperature on the functional relationship between average temperatures and the yield of different crops. What I want to just summarize here is that the impact of larger changes or increases in average growing season temperatures for key commodities like rice is significant. So you can see here in the first graph, the impact of a 4-degree increase in average growing season temperatures for rice is substantial. And that's compared to a negative 14% here. And that's compared to the average growing season condition in a past climate, so between 1986 and 2012. And already during that period, we could see that the optimal conditions when looking at the relationship between productivity and temperature, was below optimum. If we look at another example, the impact of extremes, there's also increasing evidence that, for example, extreme precipitation can have a substantial additional negative impact on the yield outcomes of, say, rice, in this example coming from China. We also know that in terms of how farmers respond to this type of information, they're responding particularly to extremes. And this comes from very interesting research in Southeast Asia, which is basically showing that farmers don't necessarily work with average conditions when thinking about, how much or what area to plant when it comes to a specific crop. They pay attention to extremes. So in this case, this research was looking at how moderate extremes affect the planting and growing season area of rice across Southeast Asia. And just to summarize very quickly, what it shows is that the moderate extremes are very important. So whether there's significant rainfall during the sowing season, whether there's significant increases in temperatures or dry periods, this is what farmers respond to. And this gives us a clue as to what transformative adaptation might look like. Now, examples of adaptation, there are very good examples out there. This is a nice example from China, which showed the potential impact of changing varieties in response to changes in growing season conditions for maize in the northeast of the country. And very quickly, what it shows is that by moving to new varieties, in this particular region of China, farmers were able to maintain or even improve productivity. If they had maintained their previous practice, then on the left-hand side here, you can see that the impacts would have been severely negative. Now, looking to the future transformative adaptation, what can we do to promote transformative adaptation or transformational adaptation based on the on the information that we have and the examples that we've been able to work with. We need to think about depth, scope, speed, sustainability, relevance, and whether it's pushing the limits of challenges that face to multi-sectoral adaptation that reaches a range of different socioeconomic groups. When looking at the UNFCCC report on transformative adaptation, their assessment of progress against these types of adaptation in the region is that progress is very low. And the reasons for this, there are a number of reasons in the agricultural system and the food system as to why progress could be slow. When we talk about substantive impact, there is, for example, very sticky there's stickiness in practice on farm. So there's cultural reasons why farmers adhere to certain practices. There's tradition. There's also experience with past seasons can have an impact on whether new measures are adopted. In terms of scope, we're trying to work with many smallholders across a large area. There's challenges with dissemination and demonstration. And when it comes to incentives for farmers, they're seasonal, which can have impact on longer term sustainability. And while there are a number of commitments already to look at food systems adaptation, sometimes moving to implementation of action on the ground can be challenging. So to try and to wrap up my short intervention, at FAO with partners, as I mentioned, we are looking at ways to promote transformative adaptation. We're using a number of entry points, which can include things like innovation, private sector engagement, working with whole of government, using principles like gender and social inclusion. And there are some practical examples we can work with. And one that we think has a lot of scope, for example, is agricultural climate services. While this could be considered incremental in the past, there are a number of reasons to consider this as a transformative option for wide-scale change at the agri-food system level. Babu, I'll leave it there for the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Bo, for sharing particularly the status in terms of the progress and the challenges against the different elements that UNFCCC mentioned about the transformational adaptation. Thank you so much. Colleagues and the participants, let me move to the presenter, who is from the UNDP, Karma Raptan. He's currently serving as a regional technical specialist and helping develop capacity of the national and the subnational governments for adaptation planning and support countries in accessing, mobilizing, and implementing adaptation finance for resilience development. So it's my pleasure to invite my fellow colleagues from UNDP and good friend, Karma, over to you. And if you kindly share your thoughts in 5 minutes.
Yeah, thank you, Babu. So I will, without wasting any time, because I know I have only 5 minutes, quickly go through my slides in terms of this question that I was asked to address. So in terms of conceptualizing and operationalizing transformational adaptation, just wanted to highlight in the beginning that, it varies significantly across different systems due to the differing goals, structures, and vulnerabilities. But again, this shares, common system level attributes that shape how it is interpreted and implemented. Transformational adaptation involves fundamental shifts in the system in response to impacts of climate change. Transformational adaptation should be conceptualized through multidimensional approaches that goes beyond incremental changes and one that aims for system-wide shifts. It should also address current and future climate risks, not just short-term variability, and it should also challenge the effectiveness of existing systems, including social injustices and power imbalances. In health, transformational adaptation involves rethinking healthcare delivery system to respond to complex climate-induced health challenges. This includes shifting from reactive to proactive models, integrating climate resilience into public health infrastructure and addressing social determinants of health. UNDP and WHO are currently working on a number of initiatives related to health and climate. One being on Asian LDCs, one in the Pacific with the Pacific LDCs, and then we are also currently designing a global climate and health project with GCF. So that's currently under design. In livelihoods, transformational adaptation means fundamentally altering livelihood systems to withstand climate shocks. Transformational adaptation in livelihood systems require departure from traditional models of risk management and resource exploitation. And, the livelihoods area is one of the core areas where UNDP works. So I can, offer a number of examples. I did not really want to highlight any here, but if participants are interested in some examples, I'm happy to provide that. In society, transformational adaptation involves system-wide changes in socio-political, economic, and cultural structures to build climate-resilient communities. It involves addressing power imbalances, social injustices, and questioning the effectiveness of existing systems. In terms of operationalization, to operationalize transformational adaptation, the common principles, this applies across different systems that we need to consider are the following. First, integrating adaptation into national development plans, social protection systems, and alignment with frameworks like the NAP and the NDCs. Ensuring just transition pathways to make sure adaptation is fair and inclusive and avoid maladaptation by preventing displacement or economic instability. Employing innovative financing instruments and technology, essentially leveraging grant-based financing, technology transfer, and capacity building, and using digital tools to support adaptive governance. And finally, monitoring and evaluation, essentially developing indicators for transformational change, such as shift in power dynamics, governance structures, and social outcomes. In terms of the system level attributes shaping interpretations, there are several cross-cutting system level attributes that influence how transformational adaptation is understood and applied. Transformational adaptation is distinguished by its depth, fundamental shifts rather than incremental tweaks, and scale, local to global. It often requires reconfiguring entire systems like healthcare, governance, or economic structures. Equity considerations are central, and adaptation must not exacerbate existing vulnerabilities. Instead, it should promote inclusive development, social justice, and poverty reduction. Effective transformational adaptation depends on robust institutions, multi-level governance, and participatory decision-making. Society and communities must be empowered to lead adaptation efforts. Integrating scientific, local, and indigenous knowledge is vital as well. Co-production of adaptation strategies ensures relevance and legitimacy across diverse contexts. And finally, predictable grant-based financing and capacity building are essential to enable transformational adaptation, especially in developing countries. Without this, adaptation risks become conditional or exclusionary. So this is what I have in terms of responding to the questions that was asked, but I just wanted to leave you with this slide. In the interest of time, I won't go through this, but this is for people to sort of internalize. This is a UNDP perspective in terms of some insights on what are the barriers to transformational adaptation. Thank you very much. Over to Bob.
Thank you, Karma, for sharing what kind of the things happening in the three systems. I know that I did not able to give you enough time, but thank you very much for mentioning high level the changes required in the three systems that you have covered, but also how the UNDP see the different barriers to advance the transformational adaptation. Thank you so much. Thank you, Joanna, as well. I'm also keeping eye on the questions coming and Joanna responding those questions. But speaker, the panel member, please feel free to check the Q&A channel in the webinar and feel free to respond to those participants. With that, it's my great pleasure to invite Rakib from IUCN, who is the head of the regional program management in the office of sitting in Bangkok. Rakib has extensive experience in applying the resilience theory over several years and is very familiar with the realities of making such attempt in the area of surprise, the resource constraint, and the complex starting condition. So with that, I would like to request Rakib to reflect on how the transformational adaptation conceptualize and the operationalize. This is basically the question I'm asking all of the panel members, but in the context of the system that IUCN work, the land, water, and the biodiversity. So over to you, Rakib Bhai.
Thank you, Babu Bhai, and good morning, everybody. Let me just come straight to the point because we have already talked about transformational adaptation, its definition, and its attributes. Just take conditions of what we are facing about freshwater. Freshwater ecosystem importance has been recognized under SDG, UNFCCC, CBD, UNCCD, UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, Ramsar Convention, Sendai Framework, name any, its freshwater is mentioned. But what is the state? Rivers and wetlands are most threatened ecosystem globally. And since 1970, about 2/3 of the wetlands have degraded. And only 1/3 of the large rivers are flowing freely. And in terms of the freshwater species, there's a collapse of 85% since 1970. So something is not actually working. So when we are talking about transformational adaptation, where IUCN sees as nature is a centerpiece of whatever we are talking about, is transformational adaptation. So, I mean, next question is from the state, and we know the state, it's something is not working. And we also think nature has the solution and how we move forward in terms of actually making it happen. And this is where IUCN thinks as we need a deep systematic shift how society interact with nature. It should go beyond incremental change and require rethinking of governance, values, and development models. For IUCN, transformation model must work with nature, not against it, and address the root cause of vulnerability, including social inequality, environmental degradation, empower local community, and understanding that we are in a multifunctional landscape. And when we say multifunctional landscape, it can be a production landscape, as Bill from FAO and also Karma from UNDP has mentioned. I mean, we have cities, we have protected area, we have rivers, we have agricultural systems. So we have to think at all. I mean, when we say nature, IUCN is not just the protected areas. I mean, under the GBF, current GBF, the Target 1 and Target 3 talk about 30% protection of the world most critical ecosystem. But one of the tool is protected area. But what about the rest 70%, where we live, where we produce? So nature has to be in that part as well. I mean, how we do it, so we need systematic change, right kind of policy. So it's not just nature is conserved in the 30% protected area, nature is conserved in that production landscape as well. And then just to give you example, like in the lower Mekong Basin, IUCN is supporting wetland restoration to reduce flood risk, enhance biodiversity, and improve water governance. Is a shift from hard infrastructure to ecosystem-based adaptation. In the same way, in the lower Mekong Delta, we are we're introducing flood-based agriculture, aligning farming practices with nature hydrology. It restores ecosystem services while improving food security, demonstrating a multifunctional landscape approach. So, and these are the fundamental, I would say, the nature-based solutions that IUCN is promoting, which is an actions to protect, sustainably manage, and restore ecosystem that address a societal challenge, including the climate change threats. And it is a system level interventions which strengthens ecosystem resilience, support climate justice and inclusive governance, and reframe adaptation from long-term ecological and human well-being. And then it requires target setting, it requires diagnostic, it requires monitoring, how we are performing. And then IUCN is providing plethoras of tools. For example, the red list of ecosystem. I mean, it's a diagnosis tool where the investment should go, where the most critical ecosystem, and whether your intervention is working, species threat abatement and restoration star matrix, which policymakers can use. There are system level attributes. Of course, we need to talk about governance. We need to talk about knowledge system, equity and justice, which Joanna mentioned in her presentation. Adaptation must socially just, avoiding maladaptation, and ensure benefits for the marginalized communities. But just to conclude, where are the convergence? Karma talk about NAP and NDC integration. I would add NBSAP into it to bring the three essence of three Rio conventions. And everywhere now the NAP, NDC, and NBSAPs, everywhere as the NBS has mentioned. But what we have found is that scope has not been fully realized. Majority NDCs include one form or another, mostly in the afforestation and restoration. But the whole ecosystem approach, the quantified approach, is still missing. This is where we should be looking into, and we should be investing. Just one last example of how transformation can happen. Green List is another IUCN tool. In Coral Triangle, in Indonesia, Malaysia, Papua New Guinea, Philippines, Solomon Island, and Timor-Leste, we are working with ZIZ, Coral Triangle Center, and CTI CFF. We're using green listing as a gap analysis, governance integrity, and setting global biodiversity target. It's a performance assurance scheme mechanism where to attract climate and biodiversity finance, de-risking investment, enabling blended finance models. In a way, in this Coral Triangle areas and in a MPA, marine protected area, it is designed to have a transformational impact in systematic change how MPAs should manage and finance, cross-sectoral collaboration between government, communities, and investors, and it also provides scalable model for replication by others. And in conclusion, and I must say that, the way forward is redefining our relationship with nature and each other. It's about shifting system from societal, ecological, institutional. And again, nature-based solution is not a silver bullet, but if we can design it, it have a catalytic role in transformational change we urgently need. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Rakib, for sharing how it is happening, but also indicating that we need to bring the three Rio conventions together when we're talking about the nature and the nature-based solution, but also the missing aspect of the quantification. Thank you so much for mentioning that. So with that, let me move to our next speaker of the panel one, is Arghya Singh from Asian Development Bank. Arghya worked as a principal climate change specialist and involved in implementation of the ASEAN Development Bank, the climate priorities and targets by supporting the client governments in strengthening the climate adaptation related projects, the policies and the plan, as well as the investment for accessing the climate finance. He has more than 19 years of the international experience in the field of climate and disaster resilience, especially in the context of urban resilience, resilient infrastructure, the community resilience, as well as the post-disaster recovery and the reconstruction. So with that, it's my pleasure to invite Arghya to share how things are basically dealing in the context of climate change for the infrastructure, city, and industries. In the context of the conversation we are having is the transformational adaptation, how it has been conceptualized, and what is the state of the play in these sectors and the systems. So over to you, Arghya.
Thank you, Babu, so much, and thanks for inviting us. And I think thanks to my other colleagues, great presentation, Joanna, for setting the scene, which really helped me also think through the problem. I don't have slides, unfortunately, but I'm happy to just share some experiences, and I would say evolving understanding. I don't think we have quite achieved there in terms of what is transformational adaptation exactly. Now, my first point is in the context of cities, infrastructure, or industry, I think we need to understand transformational adaptation for whom? Because ultimately, cities or infrastructure are meant to provide services or jobs or livelihoods or health facilities for people at the end of the day, largely, right? So I think that is a fundamental thing we have to keep in mind, is ultimately this has to help the people, and most importantly, help the people who are most vulnerable. That's the starting point. The second point is, for me, if you want to simplistically think about incremental and transformational, the way I would think is incremental adaptation is a lot about doing things differently, whereas transformational adaptation is also about doing different things. And this is important. And what I mean by that, if you think from a city and urban context, which is facing increasing floods, of course, you can reduce floods by improving drainage and changing the design size of the drainage, for example, pipes. But you can also deal with floods by looking at land use management and zoning practices, etc. Right? So it's all about doing different things. And I would assume in many cases, addressing fundamental issues around land use, for example, is potentially more transformational than adjusting the design of a drainage infrastructure. Similarly, if you think about a country which is highly dependent on hydropower for their energy, and hydropower is facing issues because of increasing climate risk, and the country want to diversify their energy source from hydropower to renewable energy, let's say solar, for example, then that diversification allows them to move towards much more transformational change. And I could argue that that's a transformational adaptation in this particular context. Or, for example, we're doing some work in some coastal areas and highly prone coastal cities where flooding and sea level rise is a big issue. Now, you can argue that yes, you will build embankments or nature-based solutions for the population. That's great. But if in 20, 30 years from now, that particular site may not be economically feasible for settlement purposes, maybe a transformational adaptation is actually build skills and for the right kind of future jobs that population can look at. So I think the point I'm trying to make is transformational adaptation is very, very context specific, and it depends on the particular context. My third point is, I think colleagues already talked about the various attributes, whether it's a scale issue or issue of temporality, issue around distributional impacts, around characteristics. But I think for me, a transformational adaptation has to fundamentally address the underlying drivers of vulnerability, which means a lot of it is around behavioral change. It's around changing the incentive mechanism, changing the power imbalance, which a lot of colleagues talked about it actually. So for me, even when I'm thinking about cities infrastructure, I think a lot of the solution lies in governance issues around institutions, and these are critical even if you want infrastructure to promote transformational adaptation. Now, how do we go about it? Of course, we need longer term thinking. We need systems, understanding of system level risk. We also need to understand the barriers. What are the barriers that actually currently are hindering? And the barriers could be institutional, could be informational, could be technological, could be financial barriers. So I think it's important to address those, understand the barriers and address them. Lastly, for me, the key point to remember is that even if I want transformational adaptation in an urban area or within an infrastructure system, the solution may not always lie in these systems. The solution may lie in some other system, right? So, and I think this is important because we often work so much in silos. Our assumption is that if I want to make a city, thrive and prosper and be resilient, and I want transformational adaptation, the solution is in the urban sector. That may not be true. Solution may be in the education sector, maybe in totally something in agriculture sector, right? So I think that is important to understand. Secondly, I also feel that while transformational adaptation is critical in many cases, I don't think it can happen in isolation with incremental adaptation. Because even if you transform a system, that system continuously needs to adapt. The system needs to incrementally adapt moving forwards. I think these concepts need to be looked in together. Lastly, I think it's important to understand that transformational adaptation, I think, Joanna, you talked about the action itself, the act itself. While I totally agree with that, I don't think a particular action is enough to create transformational outcome. You need a range of actions to come together and work towards that outcome. And some of these actions may be physical actions like changing land use patterns, for example, but many of this is actually much more softer institutional governance, way decision-making happens. All of these issues need to be looked at if you really want the outcome to be also transformational. So I hope that helps, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Babu, you are muted.
Hello, Babu, we can't hear you. You're muted.
Oh, sorry. All right. Thank you, Argia, for sharing your thoughts, particularly mentioning the interlinkages within the system, as well as maybe in some cases, solution lies in other system too. So with that, let me move to the group of panel who will be providing the regional perspective. And let me begin by inviting the colleague from SPREP. He is Timoksi Nakelovo. Nakelovo works as a climate change adaptation officer in SPREP, and he has a wide range of exposure and gain the vast array of experiences in working with the communities as well as the technical work in the area of the climate change adaptation, the restoration, the forest conservation, as well as the coral reef management, and the community appraisal, as well as the general community development. With that brief introduction, it's my great pleasure to invite Nakelovo to share the perspective from the island setting in the Pacific. So over to you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Babu, Talofa, and Bulabinaka from Samoa here. So as Babu has said, my name is Timoedina Kalebo, the Climate Change Adaptation Officer for SPREP, sorry. Yeah, quite grateful to be involved in the webinar. I'll talk a bit about transformational adaptation practices in the Pacific. Yeah? Sorry, there we go. Okay, so I'll skip the first slide. This is just on the definition. I see Joanna has touched on that, which is from the IPCC AR6. So one of the main questions that was asked, a couple of questions were asked of us panelists, and I thought of touching on this topic of transformational adaptation in terms of one of the current practices that we're doing here in SPREP is, assisting countries with their national adaptation plans. And I see Karma as well as touched on this, as well as our friend here from IUCN on, operationalizing transformational adaptation through the current practices that we already have in climate change adaptation, and one of them is the NEPs. So for the Pacific, SPREP has come up with the Pacific National Adaptation Planning Guideline. And this was released in 2022. And we are currently assisting a couple of our countries in the Pacific to come up with their integrated national adaptation plans. So the graph on your left there is basically the steps to come up with the national adaptation plans, which is around step one on laying the groundwork, launching of the NEP process, stock taking. Step two, which is on undertaking climate impact, vulnerability, and risk assessment. And then identifying adaptation options before moving towards step three, which is on prioritization, action plans, and then costing some of these national adaptation plans. And then step four is on the MEL of the NEP. So if you see the photo on the right, that was one of the national adaptation consultations, validation workshop that was conducted last month in Nauru. So that is one of our current work that we're doing with Nauru, is to come up with a newer national adaptation plan. So in terms of NEPs, what hasn't worked? So this is what we have seen around the Pacific. So disjointed approaches to addressing climate change adaptation, lack of coordination, up-to-date climate change policies as well, and ad hoc and small scale, and also one of climate change projects. So what we see, if you see the photos on the right, for instance, in the infrastructure sector, we see roads doing their own climate proofing, climate change adaptation, and climate proofing of their infrastructure. We see ports doing their own, and then we have the airports doing their own. And also also on disjointed approaches to addressing climate change, we see in the agriculture sector, in the food security sector, agriculture doing their own, forestry doing their own. So these are what hasn't worked in terms of climate change adaptation and also NEPs. But what has worked is the sector-based approaches. I think our earlier colleague, Mr. Roy, I think touched a bit on this, which is, integrating them and addressing climate change climate change adaptation under sectoral approaches. So, for instance, in food security, bringing together agriculture, forestry, food, and also NGOs that are in playing a part in the food security of a country. Water, bringing together water authorities, planning, public works, lands. And we see some of the advantages of this is that there's improved efficiency, there's focused resource allocation, enhanced learning, and also better alignment of strategies. The last question was around does the increasing use of the term transformational adaptation enhance conceptual clarity and ambition in adaptation planning? So in terms of conceptual clarity, like most buzzwords in the climate change space. It will take some time for stakeholders to get to understand these. But I guess once we integrate them and start unpacking some of the practices, for instance, the NAPS relocation markets. So these will gain traction with amongst our stakeholders. And in terms of ambition in adaptation planning, I think this terminology is enabling, in the sense that it drives countries to think about, innovative and science-driven, but also traditional, informed by traditional knowledge, adaptation. So getting countries to think about bigger projects, programs that adequately address the root cause of vulnerabilities, rather than just small piecemeal projects that is the current practice. Secondly, I think it is and also equally important is to this terminology also gets donors ready for when large proposals comes through their pipelines. I think that's all from us in script. Thank you.
Sure. Am I audible? Okay. Thank you so much for sharing the perspective from the Pacific. I'm mindful of time, and I'm extremely sorry that I'm slightly behind the schedule, but hopefully we'll be able to manage it within the time. So without any further, let me invite David Porter, who is serving the head of the regional action and the global advocacy program of ICIMOD since July 2012. And before joining ICIMOD, David worked with the UK central government, where he spent 17 years in a range of a technical and the leadership role. So with that, over to you, David, to share the perspective from the mountain.
Great. Thanks, Babu. Can I just check you can hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Great. Thank you very much for the introduction. I'm David Potter. I'm the strategic group head for our regional and global team in ICIMOD. ICIMOD's the International Centre for Integrated Mountain Development. We're an intergovernmental organisation that represents the 8 countries with territory in the Hindu Kush Himalaya. Those 8 countries are Afghanistan, Bangladesh, Bhutan, China, India, Myanmar, Nepal, and Pakistan. I found the presentation so far fascinating because they really resonate with me and with some of the work that we're trying to do and the terms we're grappling with here in ICIMOD in the mountains. Argy's point about transformational adaptation being context specific, I think, is a really important one and one that's worth unpacking more. And I also was reflecting on his point around sectoral interrelationships. I think that's also another very key element of this concept and the way that we need to address it and focus our work. Just quickly, the Hindu Kush Himalaya itself, talking about context-specific issues, is a climate hotspot. It's being affected, along with the polar regions, more rapidly by the impacts of climate change than other parts of the planet. It's characterized by transboundary geographies and also by the transboundary impacts of climate change. It's ecologically rich, but broadly speaking, relative to other areas, under-resourced in terms of responses to the impacts of climate change. I mean, to address this, we need to address the underlying structural constraints in development. We need to think ahead more with foresight and anticipatory planning mechanisms. And we need to also foster a deep shift, I think, in the way that mountain societies think about their landscapes and their ecosystems as they change as a result of climate change. And I think transformational and transformative adaptation is a really helpful concept for rethinking the way that we might do work in the mountains. What's working, what's not working? Others have talked about some of these already, so I will only talk about them briefly. I think a key point here is different organizations I feel, are enacting transformational adaptation in different ways. So, for example, governments tend to be focusing on their NAPs and their sectoral visions and starting to see adaptation more as the redesign of development rather than a number of separate and non-connected interventions. I think NGOs tend to focus more on a bottom-up transformational process, thinking about justice, climate justice, local governance shifts, and gender and indigenous issues. ICIMOD, I think, along with other intergovernmental organizations, we're trying to focus on developing shared platforms and indicators to help our stakeholders and people in our region to translate the theory into action. I think lots of projects are still short-term and project-based. That's a problem because it makes it hard to create structural change. I think often people talk about transformational adaptation in an aspirational way without really thinking through what you need to implement on the ground and how you track progress as well. It's also really tricky. I think, overall it's hard to scale up and sustain small adaptation grassroots innovations. And I think in many areas that's a challenge. So I think lots of people are experimenting with this concept in the HKH, but we need to do more. Others have talked about systems thinking and its importance to this concept. I think risks and responses are interconnected. And at ICIMOD, what we're trying to do is we're trying to take more of a landscape approach to try and integrate our engagement with different ecosystems and governments. We're also trying to think across areas, as Argyll was mentioning, sectoral interrelationships. We have teams working on glacier issues, air quality, biodiversity, livelihoods, and we're trying to integrate the work that those teams do together to have a more kind of nexus approach. A big part of what ICIMOD is doing in this area is to try and support our stakeholders and our partners to understand what a transformational pathway might look like, developing communities of practice to help people discuss these things. And also, I mentioned before, looking ahead, working to develop and implement and train people up on using foresight and scenario-based planning tools. We've also been working to try and support the inclusion of mountain-specific indicators into the global goal on adaptation, which I think is another key tool in the UNFCCC process. Two quick examples, bearing in mind the time. The first is community learning centres. We've been working since 2024 to try and implement community learning centres across the region to help restructure agricultural extension work. We've been focusing on capacity building and providing technical guidance, and particularly focusing at the grassroots level to try and integrate climate resilient agricultural methods into local farmers' farming practices. We've seen this being scaled up over the last 2 years. A range of NGOs and INGOs have been supporting this method, and which has now been replicated across 50 villages in Nepal. So there's an element of scaling there as well, and also an element of challenging the existing agricultural methodologies. So I think that's perhaps one example to bring to the table or for us to discuss. The second is our PURE platform. PURE stands for the productive use of renewable energy. And since 23, we've been developing and supporting implementation of this, which is in essence a data-driven decision-making tool that uses geospatial data to help governments and other actors to think more holistically about renewable energy planning. So how to plan, implement and prioritize renewable energy activities across wider regions. And I think this is another, I feel, possibly a good example for us to discuss or ponder, because I think this is as it is being taken up, improving the way that governments are anticipating future needs and perhaps increasing the time span over which they are planning and thinking about their interventions in a more integrated manner. 3 final thoughts. Firstly, we've talked a lot about the terminology. I think what I see in the mountains is that different sectors do still interpret transformational adaptation in different ways. And I think the more we can do to come to a shared understanding of what transformational adaptation is, the better. That's why I think this theme for the APAN is such a great idea. We need more long-term finance. We need a lot more long-term governance thinking. I think that is a clear requirement if this is going to work. But also we need to make sure local communities are involved and we do work to try and build their leadership and their understanding in this sector. And I think that kind of work is also really essential. That's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, David. Before I request Mizono-san, may I request David and Rakib, if you kindly go to the Q&A and kindly see the type of the questions the audience ask, and so that you can reply to them. So let me invite Mizono-san, who is basically the long-standing partner of APAN, and I don't think I will be able to introduce him with properly. But Mizono-san is working for the environment for more than 35 years and one of the key partners of Asia Pacific Adaptation Network since its inception. He also worked with the RRCAP, which stands for the Regional Resource Center for the Asia Pacific, based at AIT. Also, he worked in the UN Secretary General's office as an advisory board on the water and the sanitation. So with that, let me hand over to you, Mizono-san, to share the perspective from the academic and research institutes.
Thank you, Babu, for your very kind introduction. It's my great honor to be able to join this important webinar. As introduced, my name is Osamu Mizuno from IGES. My presentation today is based on a policy brief that IGES is developing with the APAN Secretariat. The findings I'll share today directly address the 2 key questions presented for a panel, I believe. But before getting into these 2 questions, just a short problem setting. As already introduced, the IPCC provides us with key definitions for incremental adaptation and transformational adaptation, or TA in short. However, the challenge is there is no officially agreed upon definition among governments. Without a shared understanding, it's difficult to set common goals, assess proposals, and track progress. With that in mind, let me turn to the first question for our panel. The question is how are governments, NGOs, and institutions interpreting and applying the concepts, and what's working and what's not. We found that while many international organizations we interviewed refer to the IPCC definition, they see the need for a more common and practical understanding. As for what's not working, 2 challenges were pointed out: the lack of funding and a deep inertia or reluctance to move away from familiar short-term solutions. Turning to how governments are applying this concept, we looked at their national documents such as NAPs. The results are clear. Only a small group of 6 countries have made TA a core objective of their plan. The vast majority, 26 countries, don't mention it at all. So to summarize, the interpretation of a transformational adaptation is slowly converging, but the application at the national level is still very limited. Our report also makes 8 policy recommendations. I don't have time for all of them, but they point towards incorporating TA into NAPS as number 3, ensuring it's an iterative process as number 5, and addressing uncertainties as number 8. But these recommendations leads us to the second, more difficult question. The question is, does the increasing use of the term transformational adaptation actually enhance conceptual clarity and ambition? To answer this, I would say that we need to do more than just increasing the use of the term. We often focus on how to promote transformational adaptation. But we must first step back and critically ask why, when, and where. We often hear the idea that incremental adaptation is insufficient. But honestly, we do not have sufficient and detailed evidence for it. We need to make more efforts to collect evidence or conduct scientific assessments on where our current approaches will fail and how TA can overcome such challenges. In this context, for any proposed TA, we must first articulate its theory of change as a clear logical story of how a specific action will lead to a desired outcome and why it is better than what we already do. These efforts are essential not only for justifying TA and building political support, but also making TA more effective and strategic. My second point is about the bigger picture. We should frame TA as a core component of sustainable development. It means that TA should not be considered just a climate strategy, but as a part of a whole societal strategy. Because transformational adaptations, by definition, could affect all dimensions of social systems. By doing so, key concepts such as just transition or inclusion could be seen in a different way. They need to be pursued, not because they are key factors for successful TA, but because they are integral parts of our broader sustainable development objectives. This reframing helps us ensure a more holistic and balanced approach with other critical social agendas like biodiversity conservation and poverty eradication. In addition, it helps justify social investments by linking them directly to core national development goals, which is a powerful argument for finance ministries. This requires a mix of incremental adaptation actions and long-term transformational adaptation pathways, guided by a national vision for sustainable development and supported by continuous R&D and learning. So to conclude, our research confirms significant barriers to TA and summarizes practical steps to address them. But to make these steps truly effective, we also need a shift in our thinking. First, to a deeper problem recognition based on clear evidence and rigorous assessment, so that we know why we must transform and when and where. And second, to a broader vision that frames TA as part of our journey toward a sustainable society. By combining our practical policy recommendations with such deeper strategic thinking, we can truly achieve meaningful progress on transformational adaptation. So that's all from me. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mizuno-san, for sharing the policy brief that we worked together. Dear the panel members, the speakers, and the audience, I actually miserably failing maintaining the time, but as you have seen the depth of the knowledge that we have from our speakers and the information that they're providing. But it is also the new topic, and that's the reason I decided not to stop any speakers because they are providing the good examples and insight. So with that, may I just request to extend this conversation for another 10 to 15 minutes instead of closing it by 11:30 Bangkok time. Hopefully that is okay with the audience and the speakers. So this is the time for us to actually go over the questions that we have received. And first of all, I'd like to thank all the panel member and the speaker responding to 21 the questions that they have answered. And we have about 10 open, and many of those are not actually the questions. They have shared their ideas and thoughts. But let me just look into whether there are any questions that requires immediate response or not. From a quick review, I don't think that we have many left, but probably one of the questions for Rakib, if you'd like to respond to this, where the question is, how do you see advances in the technology assist in providing deeper insight on how NVS provides a catalytic impact on climate adaptation? So while you were maybe preparing yourself to respond, but let me also mention what we are aiming after this, the conversation, as I indicated at the very beginning, that we'll be preparing a summary based on our conversation today, the insights that we have received from all the speakers, as well as the questions that you have posed to the panelists and the responses that we have received. So we'll be capturing all, as well as some of the observation made by different the audience member. So with that, Rakib, do you want to take a minute before we ask my colleague to introduce the opinion poll?
Yeah, just very, very quickly is I mentioned about how you monitor. So this is where this, digitalization, AI can play a great role. Just to give you an example, is in China with Ant Group, we are helping to monitor what they're interestingly doing. They're targeting 1.2 billion people using Alipay, and then a virtual forest of creating that virtual forest and paying that creation of that forest where Ant Group is producing. I mean, Ant Group is doing the restoration on the ground, but how effective it is. This is where the technology comes in, and also an initiative like Tech for Nature, where with Huawei, we are helping to monitor the real-time governments and the protected area managers to bring innovative solutions. And of course, GIS-based special planning, special those we have been using it for a long time, and in the future as well, and integrating with AI. That is something that future. I will post a link to Panorama platform, which is itself is using digital technology to capture all the success stories from different part of the world, which you can replicate. Just have I'll just post very soon.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thank you so much. So as I mentioned, that let's stay for another 10 or 15 minutes maximum. Please allow us to complete what we have in our mind in terms of the agenda. So with that, may I request my colleague to start the opinion poll that we'd like to capture more insight from all the participants. Memangsha, you need to guide them how to do this. They need to go to the Mentimeter.
Yes.
Okay, so participants, if you kindly join us using this code in Mentimeter. And Mimangsha, maybe you'd like to, how many has joined? Okay, so I think the colleagues are joining, 7, 8. So let's give them some time. Dear audience, please join and share your views on which of the following is most essential to make adaptation truly transformational. And we have actually given you 5 choices, and you have actually the option to rank them, whether this is the top, the second top, third top, that you feel necessary in terms of making the adaptation truly transformational. We have 31, 32 colleagues join. I think I'm seeing that more participants are joining in the poll. And if not mistaken, I think the results are also visible on the screen. Hope all of you are seeing what participants are saying or providing their opinion. Out of 40, we have received the response from 34. What I'm seeing, the priority mentioned by the audience is the policy planning and the governance is the very first necessary building blocks for making the adaptation truly transformational. Second, it looks very obvious to me, particularly the finance, that is in a second one. I'm particularly happy seeing that the participants are also recognizing the science and the knowledge are very, very important. The social capital as well as the innovation and the technologies. So maybe I'd like to give 1 more minute to move to the next. All right, okay, we're moving to the next already. So let's move to the next one in terms of the transformational adaptation in the context of the systems that we talked about, the food and agriculture, water and ecosystem, the biodiversity, etc. Okay, it seems that the opinion is changing on the infrastructure, health and well-being now. Okay, it is food is moving again the top. Okay, it seems that the opinion is basically coming more on the food and agriculture, land and the water. Okay. All right, out of 45 participants join in this poll, we have received 39 responses. So far, 40. Okay, it looks the 40 audience of the 41 is basically responded to this. Let's move to the next one. What makes an adaptation intervention transformational? I think this is an open question, and you will be able to write your thoughts and opinion. Let me see what is appearing. Okay. intergenerational cooperation, system change, scale, the long-term inclusion and the cost effectiveness, leaving no one behind approach. If it is result in large benefit, sometimes, okay, so things are coming in. Issue of the equity, the long-term thinking, proactive policies and action, policy reforms, active participation of stakeholder, the system change in mindset, access to finance, international cooperation. All right, thank you so much for providing your views and thoughts in terms of where we need to put more of our energy. While you have ranked or prioritized all the enablers and the systems, I think it is also important the interlinkages among the systems as well as the enablers. So with that, I would like to thank all of you. And before I hand over to my colleague Mimamsha to wrap up by providing what are the key messages that we have heard from you. But let me mention that this was the first webinar of a series of 4. There will be another 3 webinars in upcoming weeks. Please stay tuned with the email that we are sending out from Asia Pacific Adaptation, the Secretariat, and hopefully you will be joining in our future webinars. Many of you have also provided insight as an audience. As many of you know already, the Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum is going to be held on the 29th of September to 3rd of October. Please reach out to us by sending us email, or please register yourself to join the Asia Pacific Adaptation Forum, and feel free to indicate that if you'd like to speak, moderate, or organize any session during the forum. We'll be happy to find the space for you to speak and share your insight. With that, it is my great pleasure to invite my colleague sitting beside me, Mimamsha, to wrap up the webinar session. Thank you. Thank you once again, and looking forward to seeing many of you in the APAN forum as well as the upcoming webinars.
Thank you so much, Babu. I will do a very quick summary because we're already out of time. But we had a very dynamic discussion today, and the discussion mainly focused on transformational adaptation as the topic of the webinar. So we initially heard about the definitions of incremental and transformational adaptation and how it's very important that we don't distinguish the two, because there are different adaptation actions that have different outcomes. And there is a complementary portfolio of incremental and transformational adaptation coexisting. And there are many examples of effective incremental adaptation measures that need not be transformational. And hence, there is a need for portraying adaptation as a continuum, where transformational adaptation is a component. It was also noted that it's very important that when we're designing adaptation efforts, outcomes could be transformational for rich communities, but poor communities might be impacted. So it's important to understand who is this transformational action, who is this adaptation intervention for? We need to ensure that the outcomes are beneficial for everyone. We heard from FAO mainly on transformational adaptation in agri-food systems, and we heard from Colin Ball, who mentioned that transformational adaptation in agri-food systems is essential to address the growing and systemic impacts of climate change across crops, livelihoods, fisheries, forestry, and labor. UNDP emphasized that transformational adaptation should be conceptualized through multi-dimensional approaches that go beyond incremental changes, should address future as well as current climate risks, and should also challenge the effectiveness of existing systems. UNDP shared examples relating to transformational adaptation being integrating adaptation in national development plans and also ensuring just transition pathways. IUCN mentioned about how nature has been a centerpiece for transformational adaptation, as nature has the solutions to make the transformation happen. And this entails understanding transformational adaptation in a multifunctional landscape through systems change, right kind of policies and governance, knowledge systems, equity, as well as justice. ADB mentioned about the need to understand transformational adaptation for whom, and also help people who are most vulnerable. He also mentioned about how incremental adaptation is a lot about doing things differently, and transformational adaptation entails doing different things as well. There was a very good example given about cities and urban contexts, how we can reduce floods by changing the drainage systems, etc. But we can also deal with floods by looking at land use management and doing things differently. So it could be that addressing land use is more transformational in that case. Governance was also brought up by multiple panelists to inform transformational adaptation. And it was also mentioned that solutions may look different in different systems. And it's also very important that we go beyond siloed thinking. SPREP was also talking about siloed approaches, when our colleague Timosi talked about what hasn't worked in the Pacific. Mainly it was because of lack of coordination between different sectors when they're undertaking adaptation efforts. Also, very important to note is the conceptual clarity when it comes to transformational adaptation. There are many buzzwords out there floating in the adaptation realm, and it's taking a lot of time for stakeholders to understand them. Asimo talked about how we must address the underlying structural constraints in development and foster deep shifts in how societies think about their landscapes and ecosystems. Systems thinking was also brought about by Asimo, along with the importance of using foresight and scenario-based tools. I just talked about how only a few countries have made transformational adaptation as a core objective of their plans, and also the need to do more than just using the term transformational adaptation. We need to critically ask why, when, and where. Additionally, we also heard a lot of thought-provoking examples from different systems and regions on transformational adaptation. And if participants would like to dive deeper into these examples, we are very happy to share the slides with the panelists, the panelists shared with everyone. So with that, I think we can conclude the webinar for today. And thank you so much for staying a bit longer. Really appreciate your time. And see you at the forum.
Thank you so much. Have a good day and the time of the rest of the day. Thank you very much. Looking forward to seeing you all. Thank you once again. Bye-bye.